Hi, I'm Dr. Lili, and this is my pocket pediatrician. Have you heard rumors about toxic sunscreen and that using sunscreen on your children may be more dangerous for them than the damage from the sun itself? Today we're going to sort out fact from fiction, review the actual studies that were done, and cover the best ways to keep your children safe from the sun and the consequences that can last a lifetime. So let's explore the truth together.
When the doctor says my child has a condition, I'll learn more at my pocket pediatrician.
A couple of weeks ago, I was out shopping for sunscreen for my kids for the summer, and I started thinking about an article that I read last summer from a mom who was saying she felt judged for putting sunscreen on her kids at the pool. She went on to say, I thought I was doing pretty great as a mom. I got my kids there. We had all our flotation devices, all the goggles, all the snacks and drinks and everything I needed. And there I was just slathering a little bit of sunscreen on my kids, and I was getting stared at by the other moms like I was doing something terrible. She was pretty ticked off at the way that they were judging her. She said something like she didn't know that organic sunscreen was required to have mom friends at the pool. I went back to try to find that story and I couldn't find it, but I'm not here today to talk about mom shaming or the judgy moms at the pool, but I do want to talk about the facts about sunscreen. My kids and I absolutely live outside. Pretty much it's the only way I stay sane with 4 kids in 4 years. And so we pretty much are outside all the time. We go for nature walks, we're going on bike rides, scooter rides, we're going to the pool or little league games, or we're just hanging out playing with all our friends in the neighborhood. I think it's really great for our family that we get to spend so much time together. I like that they have very little screen time, but it does mean that I have to think about sun protection for them every single day. When we think about sun protection in children, we're not just talking about sunburns and temporary pain, we're also talking about a lifetime accumulation of sun damage. It's hard to look at a toddler and consider age spots or wrinkles because it seems so far off. However, skin cancer can strike at any age, and melanoma, which is one of the most deadly cancers, often hits the young. Those of us who know people who fought and lost battles with melanoma in their teens and 20s have no trouble remembering skin protection for our children. But if you don't have that experience, you're probably not thinking about skin cancer in your children. My grandfather was a lifeguard of Irish descent in a time when sun protection meant just throwing a little zinc on your nose and heading out for the beach. Needless to say, he had multiple episodes of skin cancer throughout his life. Having part of your face cut off is not pretty. Having to go through chemotherapy and radiation is worse, and nobody wants that for their children. So let's talk about the best ways to protect your children from the sun. Children are particularly vulnerable to sun damage. Most of the damage that occurs in a lifetime actually occurs in childhood because that's when children's skin is most sensitive to the sun, and often when they're getting more exposure as well. The effects of the sun in childhood can have consequences for their entire lives. I was a child of the 80s. I grew up before sunscreen was really a thing then even. There were Hawaiian Tropic commercials for the oils to give you the deepest tans. I do remember getting a couple of burns as a kid, but I was pretty lucky because I had fairly dark skin, so I didn't get burned that often. Regardless of what your skin tone is, you're still susceptible to damage from the sun. People of all skin tones need to consider sun protection, avoiding the sun, etc. No matter how dark your skin is, you're still vulnerable to sunburn and to the long-term consequences of sun damage on the skin. Sunburns often don't appear until 6 to 12 hours after the damage has occurred. So if you're waiting for that redness, that warmth, that tenderness to tell you it's time to get out of the sun, you probably are going to have significant damage before the day is done. If you're watching this and you already have a sunburn or your child does, the best way to treat the pain is to apply cold compresses, have them take a cold bath, or you can use acetaminophen for the pain. If the sunburn's more serious and your child has blisters, fever, chills, headache, generally feeling bad, then you need to contact your pediatrician. In these cases, we treat sunburns just like we treat any other serious burn. And sometimes that means they're going to need to get IV fluids, antibiotics, or even admitted to the hospital. I've had some pretty horrific cases of sunburn in my career, and I'd really hate to see any other kids with those type of burns. So let's talk about the best ways to protect yourself from the sun. I want to focus on what the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Academy of Dermatology have to say because I feel like those are good, trusted sources. So let's talk about the best ways to prevent sun damage. For babies under 6 months, we don't recommend any sunscreen, but what we do recommend is sun avoidance. So that means keeping your baby out of direct sunlight. You can keep them in the shade using a tree. You can make your own shade with an umbrella or a tent. You can use the canopy on the stroller. And then you also want to think about your baby's clothing. Hats are obviously a great way to protect the face and the neck from the sun. Not all babies wear hats. I feel like I spent a ton of money on hats for my kids that they just would throw off the second I'd put on their heads. But if your kid will wear a hat, that's a great way to go. You want to think about long sleeves, long pants, loose, lightweight clothing so that the baby will feel comfortable but is not getting direct sunlight on their skin. If the sun is completely unavoidable, then you can use a zinc oxide paste kind of on the ears, the nose, the shoulders, hands and feet, the areas that are most likely to get exposed to the sun. But try to stay in the shade as much as possible. Avoid those peak hours between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. In babies over 6 months and young children, you can use sunscreen, which we're going to get into in a minute, but sun avoidance is still going to be the best protection. So the same thing, clothing, hats, shade, all of those things are going to help protect your child from damage from the sun. In my older kids, I still will buy them hats, and they'll promise me they'll wear whatever Spider-Man or princess hat they've picked out, and about 5 minutes after we get out of the store, it's on the ground or forgotten in the trunk of the car or something like that. So if your children will wear hats, that's great. Sometimes I just have my kids ride their bikes or scooters because at least they've got a helmet on their head, and that gives them a little bit of protection. Also, you want to remember that the sun can affect your family even on cloudy days. The UV rays are still coming through the clouds, and you're likely to spend a little bit more time in the sun because you're not feeling the heat, but you can still get damage on cloudy days, so consider some protection on those days as well. You also want to think about the fact that the sun's rays can bounce off of other surfaces, so it's not just shading from above, but you might be getting a reflection from the water, from sand, from concrete. You know, we were at the beach a couple weeks ago and we had it coming at us from all directions. Even snow can cause significant sunburns, and my husband is an avid skier. He's had a few burns in the middle of winter while skiing, so now he always wears sunblock on his face whenever he goes skiing. So let's talk about the sunscreens themselves. Whenever you're applying any kind of sunscreen, you want to do a test spot first before you apply to the whole body in case there's an allergic reaction. When you're putting it on, be careful around the eyelids and the eyes. You want to get a good thick coat on any child, so if you have an older child or an adult, you want to use about 1 ounce per application, obviously less in a younger child, but you want to get about that level of thickness on there. You need to reapply the sunscreen every 2 hours or more frequently if you're swimming, sweating, wiping down with towels. Any of those things can rub off your sunscreen. This is the one that I have a hard time with, is that you need to put the sunscreen on about 30 minutes before you go outside. I feel like sometimes if I can get all 4 of my kids somewhere and we all have shoes on, that we're winning for the day. But I should be thinking about getting the sunscreen on before we get to where we're going. Usually I'm that mom running out onto the Little League field trying to slather a little bit of sunscreen on my son before the next batter's up, but I should be doing it before we leave the house so that he has good protection. Because sun damage can actually occur in as little as 15 minutes depending on where you are. And if you have that 30-minute lag time before the sunscreen is actually effective, you can be getting damage before you even start. Also, you have to rub it in really well, but especially the face, the nose, the ears. You want to think about the back of the legs, back of your neck, the areas that kind of get neglected. So make sure you're getting all those spaces and rubbing it in well so they're protected. Anything not covered in clothes should be covered in sunscreen. So I get a lot of questions about which sunscreen is best. It's kind of a tricky question, so let's start with the basics of what you want to look for in a sunscreen. The AAP says you should have an SPF of somewhere between 15 and 50. Anything less than 15 isn't going to protect you, and I think anything more than 50 is kind of a flannel shirt. So somewhere in there. But the American Academy of Dermatology actually suggests that you start at 30. So they want you somewhere between 30 and 50 to be most effective. You need to look for a sunscreen that's broad spectrum. So that means it's going to cover against UVA and UVB rays. If you have a hard time understanding the difference, think of it as UVA rays are the ones that age you, so A for aging, and UVB rays are the ones that burn you, so B for burning. There are a lot of types of sunscreens out there, but we can usually split them into 2 categories. One that we call the chemical sunscreens and the other that we call the mineral sunscreens. So chemical sunscreens are ones that get absorbed into the skin and then start working. So they often contain things like Oxybenzone, Retinyl, Palmitate, and other chemical sounding names that you can see on the sunscreen bottles. The mineral ones contain usually zinc oxide or titanium dioxide, and those are those thick, white, pasty ones that give you protection by actually just making a physical barrier. So why was that poor mom getting glared at for putting some of those chemical sunscreens on her kids? Well, if you do an internet search, you're going to find tons of posts about sunscreen being more deadly than the sun itself, that it can cause cancer and all kinds of hormonal disturbances. I remember seeing something on Facebook about it last year and kind of dismissing it, and then all of a sudden it seemed like I couldn't scroll past anything without seeing people talking about how dangerous sunscreen was, that they were making their own, that you could go on Pinterest and find recipes, or not using anything at all. I went to Whole Foods, I spent about $35 on sunscreen, and that was the sale price. They were all made from titanium dioxide and zinc oxide, which are the natural mineral ones. I got to spray one, and I got to spray about half of a kid down with it, and the next thing I knew it clogged, and even though it was a year ago, I still haven't been able to get anything out of it. Every now and then I take it out and shake it up or put a pin in it, but nothing will come out, and I have this full bottle, which I can't bring myself to throw away because I spent so much money on it. So that one was a little bit frustrating. The other ones I got were creams and lotions, and they were really nice, and thick white creams that we were able to use for the summer, and nobody got burned, and they worked great. But I started wondering if I had bought into all the hype and spent a lot of money for no reason. So I started looking into it a little bit further. So I came across a great blog from a dermatologist who was talking about how she herself was kind of a crunchy granola organic type mom, but that she was concerned about these articles that she'd been seeing too. So she went back and reviewed the studies, and after reading her article and looking at some of the original studies myself, I want to share some of this information with you. One of the studies that caused the biggest alarm was a study that was done with the sunscreen Oxybenzone, which is one of the chemical sunscreens. So what these investigators did was they took a bunch of rats and they fed them large quantities of sunscreen, found out that they had an enlarged uterus on autopsy. So let me say that again. They fed rats large volumes of sunscreen. I don't know about you, but I'm not drinking bottles of sunscreen. I have a 2-year-old who might, but me personally, I'm not. And I'm also not a rat. So unless you're a rat that's going to drink a lot of sunscreen, I don't think you have to worry too much about this one. You know, as a person, slathering a little bit on your skin is probably not going to have the same effect. However, the Environmental Working Group, or EWG, got wind of the study and they started publishing stuff saying that sunscreen was dangerous and causing hormonal disturbances, and the next thing you know, the story spread like wildfire. This was pretty alarming from a public health perspective because a lot of people started posting about how they weren't using any sun protection, showing off their sunburns kind of proudly. And as we know, sunburns lead to skin cancers. That's really the opposite of what we want from a public health perspective. So scientists started working quickly, and what they did was they started testing people with the same sunscreen, but instead of making them drink it, they actually just applied very large quantities to their skin. Then they measured their concentrations in their blood and in their urine, and what they found was that the sunscreen was absorbed, but it was actually excreted in the urine. So anything that was absorbed was excreted, and there were actually no effects on the endocrine system in people. The study was repeated several times and had the same results every time, so there's not been any scientific evidence that sunscreen containing oxybenzone has any effect on the endocrine systems of people. They did find that some people were allergic to oxybenzone, but they also found that sometimes people were allergic to one of the other components of the sunscreen and thought it was the oxybenzone. So if you have an allergic reaction to a sunscreen, you may be allergic to the sunscreen itself, or you might be allergic to one of the fillers in it. The second study that got a lot of news was one about retinol palmitate. Now, this one was a little bit different. They took hairless mice, which are more prone to skin cancer, and they put sunscreen containing retinol palmitate on some of them, and then they didn't on the others, and they burned all of them. And then they found that the hairless mice who had the retinol palmitate had a slightly higher incidence of skin cancer in them. So this study never even got published in a peer-reviewed journal, which is a big red flag. And the lead investigator of it never recommended not using sunscreen containing retinol palmitate. But it made news. People started saying that sunscreen causes skin cancer, even though there's no plausible reason for it. After reviewing all this literature myself, I actually have no problem reaching in my bag, grabbing whatever sunscreen I can, and getting my kids covered up in it. So as long as the sunscreen is broad spectrum, has a good SPF, and I can actually get it on my children, I'm going to use it. There is some evidence that the mineral ones don't last as long or protect as well. So if you're going to use a mineral sunscreen, you just want to make sure you apply it more frequently. And even if your skin actually appears white and has that kind of whitish sunscreen glow, you may not be getting protected, so you need to keep on reapplying it even if it looks like your child has sunscreen on them. The other question I get a lot is about whether a spray or a lotion is better. So a lot of experts believe that when you spray a kid down, there's definitely an inhalation risk. So if you're going to spray a kid, never spray their face. There's also some concern that the spray may not apply evenly. So if you don't shake up the bottle really well, you might be applying liquid, but it may not have the actual sunscreen in it if it's not mixed well. Personally, for me, if I'm having to apply sunscreen to my kids multiple times every day, and myself, and sometimes my husband, that's me plus 4 kids plus a husband, I just know I'm going to forget a leg or an ear or a back of a knee on somebody. So I kind of like the sprays because I can just sort of spray all over the body on each person, and it's really quick rather than having to make sure I get lotion on every little crack and crevice. But if you do want to use a spray, the recommendation is that you actually spray twice and rub it in between so that you know that you're getting full coverage on every part of the exposed skin. Now, I feel like you can miss areas with the lotions too. I remember a really bad burn I got in Thailand one time when I just kind of took my hand and went like this, and I wound up with red and white stripes for a few weeks. So whether you're using a lotion or a spray, you've got to be really diligent. Make sure you get it rubbed in all the way, all over, and get all exposed areas covered. If you are going to use a spray, never spray the face, and get out of that cloud of sunscreen once you're done applying it. So when I do spray my kids, I spray them down and say, now move, so that they're not standing there just breathing it in. Remember though, for everybody, your best protection is going to be sun avoidance. Avoid those peak hours between 10 and 4. Find shade or make your own with umbrellas or strollers or clothing or hats or whatever you can do. Don't forget your eyes, so sunglasses are important, and make sure they actually have UV protection in them. All of these physical barriers are much better protection than sunscreen alone. My family lives for our fun in the sun, but we drench ourselves in sunscreen, cover up as much as possible, and we really avoid those peak hours if we can. I hope this really cleared up some of that sunscreen confusion out there for you. Please subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments. This is Dr. Lili with My Pocket Pediatrician. Thanks for stopping by.
When the doctor says my child has a condition, I'll learn more at My Pocket Pediatrician.